Greetings and citations, everyone. One of the things that might have gone over everyone's heads upon the several announcements and details we got on February 5th was that it would seem that they want to expand on the leveling experience for World of Warcraft. And this may very well bring on the opportunities for all of the racial starting zones to reflect the many changes they've endured since the last time we visited each of them during the breaking of the Cataclysm to our world, or the very exploration of the Wandering Isles. That's one of my favorite zones. It's one of my favorite starting zones. Which is something the player base and myself have been begging for such a long time now. To return to the places of old and see them with a more modern flair, but also in its story and its visuals. But as always, I want to preface that this is just my own conclusion. I don't think they've confirmed anything just yet, only that they're looking into expanding leveling again, which could mean all sorts of things. As you might remember, they toyed with such an idea of expanding on their leveling when we started our journey on Azeroth through the voyage to the Exile's Reach, a heavily contested isle with Quillboar, Murlocs, Harpies, and more notably ogres. It was a decent introduction, or alternative to the world of Azeroth and its many races and factions. But it was far from perfect and really forgettable, really. While I can't speak for everyone, I just opt for the older versions of leveling instead. Are they a bit dated and long? Well, sure. They're well over a decade old, but they've still got charm and are at least rich with lore and themes. And some of them really do hold up today. Exile's Reach felt more like an imperfect or safer tutorial or a tour to the world, not really a big story or exploration to Azeroth and her peoples. And while it did feel like it was necessary to do something like it at the time, I think it wasn't the solution to the problem. I think it failed in many aspects and wasn't the hook that Warcraft needed for both new and old players. Which, yeah, today's leveling is confusing too, especially since it relies on Chromie to steer you in where to go in the timeline, relying way too much on the past rather than on the present. And most new players are just thrown into what the latest story is too, which I think is even more confusing and not very helpful, because the story and characters are felt more when you've done the overall story throughout the years, not the tail end of it that is Dragonflight or War Within. And to give Cataclysm its flowers real quick here, while it was flawed in many of its zones, some zones and starting zones weren't even really given much of a revamp at all. The revamps that we did get were centered on the aftermath of the Lich King's demise, or Deathwing rising out of the Maelstrom. Those were really friggin' good, and added to the world building of Azeroth that was desperately needed for many of its races and leaders. But if they expand on Exile's Reach, they'll need to do a lot more on top of it, both in terms of gameplay and story, because it really doesn't do a good job of telling the player base both. Which, while I don't think is an impossible task, it does feel like the better solution and easier solution in some ways is to finally up the zones of old instead. It would be, in my opinion, make old fans just happier. Keep Exile's Reach as an option, sure, but I think it's high time we finally see Durotar, Mulgore, Kazan, Wandering Isles, Elwyn Forest, Azmist Isle, and etc. be remastered in the modern era of Warcraft. No longer would it be centered on the Cataclysm and what changes Deathwing brought to the world finally. I'm not sure if they could find a way to keep it as an option, but we do have Cataclysm Classic, soon to be Mista Pandaria Classic, just in case such a thing is lost to time in retail. But ideally, I think just keeping it somewhere would be nice to those who'd want to revisit it whenever they want. This really has lined up with everything that they've been doing too lately, both in-universe and out. We've seen leaders stand down and new leaders stand up, like the new Desolate Council for the Forsaken, or the retirement of Gen, Malfurion, and Tyrande, allowing their children, of both Tess and Chandrist, to take over in their absences. We've seen zones face entirely new means of resource or even structure, like the Orcs gaining a new oasis for Durotar, and the Draenei building an entirely new city, or the Night Elves gaining an entirely new foothold and home with a Midrisil on the Dragon Isles. There's a great number of stories that they could expand upon with all of those. We really have seen so much expansions to the world, and it feels like it's coming to a boiling point, where we'll see more added to those places of old that we've been helping lately. Ioneus was just retaken back from the Scarlet Crusade, and has a new queen. Perhaps we can see the conflicts of what that means, and finally Tess to become a Worgen by her own merits and choice. The Orcs also just regained their identities with several of their clans and several new chieftains, while also many of them coming from Outlands to Azeroth. And with a new oasis that I just mentioned on the way, this gives more reasons for us to see several Orcish clans be active in Durotar, and see what awaits them because of that. This could even expand onto their very own city of Orgrimmar, which we could see grow larger, but also become less of a fortress and more of a home again. Maybe we'd even see a perfected port finally. For the Night Elves, they've got a lot of work to do for their ancient homelands on Kalimdor, and while their new home is currently on the Dragon Isles with a Midrisil, nothing is stopping them from going to Darkshore like they promised, and starting their efforts on the restoration to that land, so that one day it can bloom into Teldrassil and have a new Darnassus there. And those are just the tips of the iceberg. So many changes appear to be going on with so many of the nations and lands that we all have started in. And that gives more of an easy window for Blizzard to take and expand upon. And we also know that both Quel'Thalas and Northrend are about to see a facelift in both Midnight and Last Titan, so it only makes sense that we'd see a slower revamp in the rest of the world for all of the starting zones too. Quel'Thalas being faced with the threat of the Void as it floods straight from the Sunwell, well, we know that we'll have to deal with that in the lands of Eversong then, and what better way to show us a peek at that through Eversong getting a revamp to showcase that, for the younger Blood Elves to take a fight against the Void as it threatens their land. It could be a great way to help set up the story for Midnight in general, really. Last Titan could also be a good time to up the ante of what's going on with the two hero classes of both the Death Knights and the Demon Hunters. The Death Knights lack a Lich King and seem to have the Four Horsemen in their place. Perhaps in the Cold North we could see a new form of Death Knights rise up in the wake of the Scourge's total defeat. Illidan is seemingly coming back and may have new orders for his Demon Hunters. Perhaps it's time to recruit more than just elves into their ranks. Just some examples of what could await us in the starting zones for hero classes too, but I'm not expecting anything that grandiose just yet. I foresee them taking baby steps here. And those kind of steps also give more time to refine it, and give a clearer idea of what Azeroth today could look like. As before, I think Cataclysm's issue was that they were pressed for time and had to update almost all of Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms within a year or so. Another issue with Cataclysm's revamp was that it was entirely reliant on Deathwing reshaping the world and breaking it, and we've been seeing those fires that he's created since. Here we could be ahead of the game and keep the door open for a more modern day storytelling of those zones and not be locked behind that. The new narrative behind those zones could still expand with the rest of the current world for sure, but I also don't think they want to lock themselves behind a single threat either. By having them do less, it also means that they can ironically do more. And with both Durotar and Elwyn Forest having the new housing system soon, I also think that gives more of a reason to give a graphical and narrative update to both of those. Not necessarily only doing those two zones, but I do think it makes sense to start with those two. Ideally, I'd want them to do a revamp to the stories of every single race and their starting zones first and foremost. That's a lot of work. It would make sense if in that very article that they stated on how they want this to be something that they're expanding on in the years to come for the future. But I do think it is necessary for players old and new. This would be a great means to really pull in everybody and make them excited, because these old zones matter a great deal to a number of people. It's where they got their first start as heroes of Azeroth. And for those who'd be unfamiliar, it'd be a great way to show them the characters and setting without confusing them. I think that's one of the many things people need, is a refresher or a slow burn on what the heck Azeroth is, what its races are, its leaders, its champions, etc. Will we at long last witness to the new starting zones? Gods, I hope so. Midnight would be the perfect time to do this, especially with Quel'Thas's Void Invasion, and the new housing system for both the Orcs' lands and the humans. But that is 13 of the original races that they'd have to cover, and like I said, it's not an impossible task, and is a probably easier task what they had to do with Cataclysm comparatively. But it is a lot of work, and I anticipate they might need more time to do this. And I mean, hell, I know what I just said, but maybe they're crazier than I thought, and they might just save this for a world update for the entirety of Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms. That would be nuts to do after the World Soul Saga. But tell me your thoughts on this. Do you think we'll be seeing an update finally for the original races, or do you think it'll be more like the Exiles Reach in its situation? What kind of stories would you like to see for your favorite races? Let me know in the comments. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to hear from me and my community, feel free to join us in our Discord. Or, if you like me enough, please support me on my Patreon, like these amazing folks here. You can also hit that join button too. All helps in keeping this channel alive and well. But until next time, my friends, see ya!